A little girl's trembling voice pierced the quiet morning, fragile yet heavy enough to shatter her mother's world. "He promised it wouldn't hurt, Mommy, but now it hurts so much." The words slipped from Lily Miller's lips like broken glass, and with them came a chill that lodged deep into Eleanor Miller's chest. Was this just a child's confused secret, or the first sign of something unspeakable lurking in plain sight? No one had an answer except a German Shepherd K9, whose instincts would soon outmatch every doubt, every comforting lie adults wanted to believe. In Redwood Falls, Minnesota, winter still clung stubbornly to the town, icicles dripping slowly from the eaves as the pale sun began its climb. Inside Eleanor's sedan, the hum of the heater could not silence the storm gathering between mother and daughter. Eleanor, 33, her grace weathered by years of night shifts at the community hospital, gripped the steering wheel as though it were the only steady thing left. Her daughter Lily, just 6, sat small and trembling in her booster seat, clutching her one-eyed teddy bear, Mr. Buttons, as though he were a shield against the world. This morning should have been ordinary. Eleanor had picked Lily up from the Bennett's house, her oldest friends, Sarah and Jack, people she trusted like family. She had expected the usual chatter about popcorn and blanket forts, about whispered giggles under twinkling string lights. Instead, she was met with silence. And then that trembling confession. Sarah's warm smile at the door, Jack's easy laugh, everything had seemed normal. But now, with Lily's words echoing like a wound that refused to close, Eleanor's certainty began to fracture. She told herself it had to be nothing, a bad dream, a child's misunderstanding. Yet, as the frost outside melted into glittering rivers along the glass, Eleanor realized her life was about to splinter in ways she could never have prepared for. Because sometimes the most terrifying truths don't scream. They whisper from the mouth of a child, from the silence between friends, from the loyal growl of a dog who senses what no one else dares to see. And what began as a mother's quiet drive home was about to ignite a chain of revelations that would turn Redwood Falls upside down. Emma had hugged Lily goodbye, promising they would play again soon. Nothing seemed unusual, nothing seemed wrong. But now, driving away, Eleanor saw her daughter's silence. The car hummed softly over the frosted pavement, but the stillness from the back seat grew heavier with each passing second. Eleanor adjusted the rear-view mirror. "Sweetheart," she asked gently, "did you have fun last night?" For a moment, Lily didn't respond. Her small hand squeezed Mr. Buttons tighter, pressing the bear against her chest as though to muffle something inside her. Then, in a trembling whisper, she spoke words that froze Eleanor's breath. "He promised it wouldn't hurt, Mommy, but now it hurts so much." Eleanor's knuckles widened on the steering wheel. Her heart lurched violently. The sentence came out. Fractured, broken, yet heavy with meaning. Panic roared in her chest. She flicked on the hazard lights and steered the car sharply to the side of the road. Undoing her seatbelt, Eleanor turned, her whole body trembling. "Lily," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "What do you mean, sweetheart? Who promised it wouldn't hurt? Show me, baby." Lily's lips trembled as tears spilled down her cheeks. She sniffled and pointed a trembling finger to her side, just above the hip. Her voice was barely a whisper. "It really hurts here, Mommy." Eleanor's breath came fast. With shaking hands, she lifted the hem of Lily's pajama top. What she saw made her stomach twist, a spreading bruise, bluish-purple against the fragile canvas of her daughter's skin. The mark was unmistakable, the kind of injury that didn't come from a simple bump into furniture. Eleanor's pulse hammered as her thoughts spiraled into 1,000 dark directions. No, she thought. Not Sarah, not Jack, not in that house. But Lily's words echoed, relentless. He promised it wouldn't hurt. Her chest ached as if someone had gripped her heart in a fist. For years, she had trusted the Bennetts with her child, letting Lily laugh and sleep under their roof without hesitation. Could she have been blind? Could there have been shadows in that home she never saw? Eleanor pressed her, hand against her daughter's tear-streaked cheek. "It's okay, baby," she whispered, though her own voice cracked. "I've got you. Mommy's here." Her decision was instant. She turned back to the front, shoved the gear into drive, and steered back onto the road. She didn't head left toward their modest apartment on Cedar Street, where the comfort of home might have beckoned. Instead, she flicked her signal right, the tires crunching over frost as she aimed the car toward Redwood Falls Community Hospital. Her mind raced. As a nurse, she knew when. Something wasn't right. This bruise was wrong. Lily's words were wrong. Every Instinct screamed at her to act, to find answers before the nightmare in her imagination became real. The heater blew, warm air across the windshield, but Eleanor felt cold sweat bead at her temples. Her grip on the wheel was so tight her knuckles HD. Behind her, Lily whimpered softly, clutching Mr. Buttons as though holding on to the last bit of safety in the world. Eleanor blinked back tears. She thought of the Bennett, of Sarah's kind smile, of Jack's rough laughter. She thought of Emma's happy giggles. Could she really suspect them? Could she really believe someone she trusted had hurt her child? The hospital loomed ahead, its brick facade reflecting the morning light like a fortress. For the first time in years, Eleanor felt like she was walking into it, not as a nurse, but as a mother, fighting for her child. She pressed harder on the gas, each block bringing her closer. Her thoughts swirled with fear and dread, but one promise burned steady in her chest. Whatever had happened, she would uncover it. She would protect Lily, even if it meant breaking every bond she thought unshakable. And so, with her daughter, crying softly in the back seat and a bruise blooming dark against her small body, Eleanor steered toward the packless hospital, her heart braced for whatever terrible truth might await. The sterile lights of the Redwood Falls community hospital cast a pale glow over the emergency wing. Eleanor sat hunched in, a chair against the wall, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, staring at the floor tiles as though they might offer her answers. Beside her, little Lily clutched her teddy bear, Mr. Buttons, her tiny chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. The bruises on her side had been documented, photographed, and examined, but no clarity had emerged, only more questions. When the attending physician, Dr. Caroline Hughes, entered the room, Eleanor looked up. Caroline was in her mid-32nd, with auburn hair tied in a loose braid and a pair of wire-rimmed glasses that gave her a studious air. Her posture was upright, her manner inefficient, but her hazel eyes betrayed a well of compassion. She had a reputation for caution, never dismissing anything unusual, no matter how small. Caroline crouched down gently beside Lily, her stethoscope dangling from her neck. "You're very brave, sweetheart," she murmured, brushing a stray curl from Lily's damp forehead. Then rising, she turned toward Eleanor, her voice lowered to a whisper meant only for the mother. "Eleanor," she said carefully, "the bruising pattern isn't ordinary. Combined with what you told me, her words in the car, I'm concerned. It could be accidental, but it could be something else. Protocol requires me to notify law enforcement." Eleanor's chest tightened. She wanted to argue, to insist this was just a terrible misunderstanding, but her training as a nurse told her the same thing Caroline was saying. When it came to children, you never took chances. Caroline stepped out, her shoes clicking softly on the linoleum, and made the call. Within half an hour, the sound of heavy boots echoed down the corridor, followed by a steady, purposeful stride. Detective Daniel Harris entered the emergency department. He was in his early 42nd, with a tall, broad-shouldered build that filled the hallway. His square jaw was lined with a day's stubble, and faint creases etched into his forehead spoke of long nights spent on duty. His dark hair, peppered with early streaks of gray, was cropped short in the manner of a man who valued order. His eyes, deep-set, steel blue, carried the weight of too many cases involving pain and betrayal. Daniel had once lost a partner during a failed raid. Years ago, a scar invisible to most, but which shaped the quiet gravity of his presence. Walking at his side was his partner, not human, but no less formidable. Rex, a 6-year-old German Shepherd K9, moved with controlled precision. His coat was a striking blend of black and tan, glossy under the fluorescent light. At 80 pounds, he was powerful, his muscles taut beneath his fur, yet his amber eyes glimmered with loyalty. His ears stood erect, every sense alert, while his gait betrayed discipline, honed through years of service. Rex had been trained not only to track sense and detect danger, but also to offer comfort in moments of fear, something Daniel had seen countless times on chaotic crime scenes. Nurses in the hallway instinctively stepped aside as the pair entered. Daniel's presence commanded attention, but it was Rex who drew the hushed admiration of the staff. The animal carried himself with the quiet authority of a seasoned officer. Eleanor rose shakily to her feet when they arrived. She felt dwarfed by Daniel's height, yet It was Rex's penetrating stare that held her frozen. For a moment, she thought the dog could see straight through her anxiety, sniffing out every fear she tried to bury. Miss Miller. Daniel's voice was deep, calm, almost growly. He extended a hand, firm but respectful. Detective Harris, Redwood Falls Police Department. This is my partner, Rex. Eleanor shook his hand, her grip weak. Thank you for coming. Daniel studied her pale face, her trembling shoulders. Years of interviewing parents had taught him to recognize the difference between hysteria and genuine fear. Eleanor Miller, he decided, was terrified in a way no performance could feign. Let's start with your daughter, Daniel said gently. His eyes flicked to Lily, who had shrunk deeper into her mother's side at the sight of the uniform. But Rex took a step forward, lowering his massive frame until he sat directly across from the little girl. Slowly, carefully, he tilted his head and sniffed the air. His amber eyes softened and his tail gave a single sweep across the floor. Lily blinked. The dog didn't loom or bark. He simply sat there waiting, his ears flicking with patient attention. Tentatively, Lily loosened one arm from her teddy bear and reached out. Her small fingers brushed Rex's fur. The dog leaned forward just enough to let her feel the warmth of his coat. A tiny smile flickered on Lily's lips for the first time since morning. Eleanor's throat tightened at the sight. Daniel knelt beside his dog, his voice quiet. Rex helps me figure out what happened when words are too hard to say. Do you mind if he checks your clothes, Lily? Lily looked at her mother for reassurance. Eleanor nodded quickly. Rex shifted, sniffing delicately around the hem of Lily's pajamas, where the bruise lay hidden beneath. He paused suddenly, inhaling deeper. A low growl rumbled from his chest, not threatening, but alert. His ears snapped forward, his body tensing. He looked back at Daniel, issuing the silent signal they both knew well. Daniel's eyes sharpened. He glanced at Eleanor. He's picking up something unusual. Caroline, who had returned quietly, added, There was a strong antiseptic smell on the wound when I first examined her. It struck me as out of place. Children don't usually come home from a sleepover with medical-grade antiseptic on them. Eleanor pressed a trembling hand to her forehead. What does that mean? Daniel rose slowly, crossing his arms, the lines on his forehead deepening. It means someone treated her wound before you saw it. Someone applied antiseptic, probably with good intentions. But it explains her words. He promised it wouldn't hurt. Whoever it was, they told her that. But antiseptic stings. To a 6-year-old, that can feel like betrayal. The word sent a shiver through Eleanor. For a fleeting moment, she felt both relief and horror. Relief that perhaps Lily's suffering wasn't born of cruelty, but horror that she still didn't know the full story. Rex remained seated by Lily's side, pressing closer now, his steady warmth acting as a shield. The little girl leaned against him, resting her cheek against the curve of his neck, as though he were a living pillow. The sight nearly undid Eleanor. Daniel watched quietly, his expression softening. He had seen Rex comfort countless children in moments of chaos, but it never failed to strike him how easily the dog's presence could pierce fear where words failed. Miss Miller, Daniel said at last, his voice steady, we'll need to follow up. I'll begin gathering more details about where your daughter was and who treated her, but for now, you did the right thing bringing her here. Eleanor lowered herself back into the chair, her body limp with exhaustion. The world felt as though it had tilted on its axis. Friends, now shadows of suspicion, safety now in question. And yet, as Lily nestled against the German shepherd, Eleanor allowed herself a fragile breath. Her daughter wasn't entirely alone in this. There was a dog, steady as stone, who had already caught the scent of truth. The world outside might have been breaking apart, but inside that hospital room, Lily clung to Rex, and Eleanor clung to the fragile hope that answers, however painful, were finally within reach. The pediatric wing of Redwood Falls Community Hospital had been transformed into a softer world than the rest of the building. Here, the harsh smell of antiseptic was subdued by the scent of crayons and fresh paper. The walls were painted in murals of forests and rivers with smiling animals peeking out from the corners. In one particular room, a brightly colored playmat stretched across the floor, scattered with dolls, toy cars, and a miniature dollhouse. It was a space designed to invite children to open up without realizing they were being interviewed. Eleanor sat stiffly in a chair near the window. Her hands clasped together so tightly her knuckles were pale. She felt like she was watching her daughter through a pane of glass, close enough to reach, yet separated by the weight of everything unsaid. Lily was seated on the playmat, cross-legged, clutching Mr. Buttons as though he were part of the conversation. Across from her sat Dr. Margaret Peterson, the hospital's child psychologist. Dr. Peterson was in her mid-42nd, a woman of average height with curly auburn hair that fell loosely around her shoulders. She wore no white coat, just a soft gray cardigan over a lavender blouse. Colors chosen deliberately to avoid intimidating her young patients. Her gentle brown eyes conveyed patience, and the faint laugh lines around them spoke of years spent coaxing secrets from frightened children. She placed a set of crayons in front of Lily and spoke in a voice low and warm, almost like a lullaby. "Lily, I heard you had a sleepover at your friend Emma's house. That sounds like fun. Can you tell me what you played?" Lily sniffled and rubbed the corner of Mr. Buttons against her face. Then, almost shyly, she picked up a purple crayon and began to draw wide, looping lines. "We built a fort with blankets," she said quietly, "and we watched Frozen, and Emma's dad made pancakes that looked like stars." Dr. Peterson leaned in, her smile encouraging. "Star pancakes? That sounds magical. What else did you do?" Lily hesitated, her small fingers tightening on the crayon. She lowered her voice to a whisper, as though the walls themselves might scold her. "We played on the rocket ship." Dr. Peterson tilted her head. "A rocket ship? That sounds exciting. Can you tell me more about it?" The little girl's eyes flicked toward her mother, who gave a small nod of reassurance. Taking a shaky breath, Lily continued. "It was in their backyard. It was super big and bouncy. Emma said it was a secret just for us. Mr. Bennett blew it up with a machine and said it was just a bouncy house, but we called it our rocket ship to Mars." Her hands spread apart to show the size of it, her face momentarily lit by the memory. But then, her expression dimmed. "I was the captain. I climbed up the tower, the highest part. I wanted to do a space. Jump like the astronauts." Eleanor's stomach twisted as she leaned forward, hanging on to every word. "I jumped," Lily whispered. "But I slipped. I didn't land on the soft part. I fell on the hard part at the bottom. It hurt really bad." She rubbed her hip, her lower lip trembling. Dr. Peterson's voice remained steady. "That must have been very scary." "What happened then?" Mr. Bennett came running. Lily said he looked scared. "He carried me inside. He put something cold on my hip. Then he used medicine. He said it wouldn't hurt, but it did. It stung a lot." Her words cracked, and she buried her face into Mr. Buttons. Eleanor pressed her hand to her mouth, fighting the rising tide of grief and confusion. There it was again, that terrible phrase. "He promised it wouldn't hurt." Dr. Peterson gently patted the floor near Lily. "You were very brave, telling me all that." "Thank you, Lily." She glanced at Eleanor, then at the door. "I think we should bring in Detective Harris now." Moments later, the door opened and Detective Daniel Harris entered with Rex padding silently at his side. Daniel's tall frame filled the doorway. His broad shoulders were still, wrapped in his dark winter jacket, and his boots carried the faint crunch of snow tracked in from the outside. His face was solemn, but softened slightly as he took in the sight of the child curled around her teddy bear. Rex moved first. The German shepherd lowered his body into a crouch as he approached Lily, his tail sweeping the floor. For once in reassurance. His black and tan coat gleamed under the soft lights, and his amber eyes fixed on the girl with a steady calm. Without hesitation, Lily released Mr. Buttons just enough to press her small hand into Rex's fur. Eleanor exhaled shakily. For the first time in hours, she saw her daughter's fear ease. Daniel crouched nearby, his deep voice careful and deliberate. "Lily, Rex has a very special nose. He can smell things we can't. Do you have something he can check?" Dr. Peterson nodded toward the small tray on the counter. Resting there was the used bandage that had been removed from Lily's hip earlier. It bore faint traces of antiseptic, the sharp odor still clinging to the gauze. Daniel picked it up carefully with gloves and held it out. "Rex," he said firmly. The dog stepped forward, sniffing intently. His ears flicked back, then shot upright. He inhaled again, more sharply this time. Then, with a suddenness that made Eleanor's heart jolt, Rex let out a low, resonant bark that echoed in the small room. The sound wasn't aggressive, but it carried weight. A signal. Daniel's eyes narrowed. He exchanged a look with Dr. Peterson before turning to Eleanor. The scent is strong, too. Strong? This isn't the kind of antiseptic you'd expect on a child's scrape. Someone used a stronger solution than necessary. Eleanor's chest tightened. But why would they do that? Daniel's jaw tensed, the stubble on his chin catching the light. Could be someone thought they were helping. Could be they didn't know better. But what Rex is telling us is this. Someone definitely treated her, a wound, before you saw her. And that means there's more to uncover. Eleanor sank back into the chair, her face pale. The puzzle pieces spun in her mind. Her daughter's whispered words, the bruise, the antiseptic sting, the trust she had placed in the Bennett. None of it fit neatly together. Rex returned to Lily's side, pressing his head gently into her lap. The little girl stroked his ears, finding comfort in his warmth. Eleanor watched, her heart aching with gratitude for the dog, who seemed to carry more certainty than all the adults in the room combined. Daniel straightened, his steel blue eyes glinting with resolve. "We're closer now," he said. "The rocket ship, the fall, the antiseptic, it's a story with pieces. Rex just confirmed what we suspected. Someone intervened. My job is to find out who and why." The room fell quiet, except for the sound of crayons scratching paper as Lily began to draw again. Her picture was simple. A tall, colorful tower with two little stick girls at the top. Across the bottom, she scrolled a small rectangle, jagged and uneven. She pointed to it silently. "That's where I fell," she whispered. And for Eleanor, the truth felt both nearer and farther than ever, the mystery deepening with each fragile word her daughter shared. Snow still lingered along the edges of Redwood Falls, clinging stubbornly to the shadows, even as the late morning sun rose higher. Detective Daniel Harris parked his unmarked sedan in front of the Bennett residence, a modest, two-story colonial with white siding and green shutters. A swing creaked gently in the front yard, moving with the wind like a silent metronome. Beside him in the passenger seat, Rex let out a short, eager huff, his amber eyes fixed on the house. The German shepherd's ears twitched, alert as always, every nerve alive to the scents and sounds that lay ahead. Daniel rubbed a hand over his jaw, feeling the coarse stubble that had grown since dawn. He had been on countless calls like this, but when it involved children, the weight always pressed harder. His own reflection in the rear-view mirror reminded him of that burdened steel blue eyes ringed by shadows, a face weathered not by years. Alone, but by memory. He reached for the door handle, and Rex leapt down with practiced grace, his black and tan coat rippling like liquid muscle. The Bennett met them at the door almost immediately. Sarah Bennett was the first to appear. She was in her late 32nd, tall and slender, with chestnut brown hair pinned into a neat twist at the nape of her neck. Her pale skin flushed easily, and this morning her cheeks were already blotched with worry. She wore a cardigan, the color of oatmeal, her hands twisting the hem as she stepped outside. Sarah's eyes, soft, hazel, framed by faint crow's feet, were the kind that normally radiated warmth. She was a kindergarten teacher by trade, known in town for her calm patience with even the most unruly children. But today, anxiety had tightened her features. Behind her came Jack Bennett, broad-shouldered and sturdy, with the unmistakable look of a man who had worked with his hands all his life. He was in his early 42nd, his sun-weathered skin tanned and rough, his short-cropped sandy hair beginning to gray at the temples. A thick beard framed his square jaw, trimmed neatly, but unable to soften the sternness of his face. Jack worked construction, and his powerful build told of long days, hauling lumber and steel beams. His neighbors often described him as dependable, the kind of man who would plow someone else's driveway without being asked. Yet, behind his rugged exterior, there was a quiet gentleness, especially when it came to his daughter, Emma, and to Lily, whom he had always treated as family. "Detective Sarah," said quickly, her voice tense. "Thank you for coming. Please, whatever you need." Daniel gave a curt nod. "We'll start in the backyard." The Bennett exchanged a glance before leading him and Rex through the side gate. The crunch of boots on frozen ground echoed in the still air. The backyard bore all the familiar marks of family life. A swing set half buried in snow, a sandbox with toy shovels still sticking out of the frost. And, in the center, like a collapsed giant, the remains of the inflatable bouncy house, the rocket ship, as Lily and Emma had called it, now sagged across the lawn in colorful folds of nylon. Its once proud tower slumped sideways, the bright blues and reds dulled by a thin layer of frost. Rex bounded forward, nose close to the ground. His breath puffed white clouds as he circled the structure, tail stiff, body alert. Daniel followed, his eyes narrowing as he studied the deflated castle. Rex stopped suddenly at the base of one of the towers. The dog's ears pricked, and a low growl vibrated in his throat. Daniel crouched beside him. There, half hidden by the collapsed nylon, was a rigid plastic frame that supported the structure when inflated. One corner jutted out sharply, its edge hard and unforgiving. Daniel traced the banded line of the plastic with his gloved hand, imagining the fall. From the top of the tower, nearly 7 foot when inflated, a child could easily slip. The descent would be long enough, the landing brutal enough. A small body, striking that edge, could produce exactly the kind of bruising he'd seen on Lily. He rose slowly, brushing snow from his knees. "That's it," he murmured. "If she fell from up there, the injury matches perfectly." Jack's voice broke the silence. "She climbed higher than she should have. I told them not to, but his." Words faltered, guilt darkening his weathered face. Sarah placed a hand on his arm, her own lips pressed tight. They were pretending. Daniel astronauts. They thought it was harmless. Rex had already moved on, his nose twitching as he trotted toward the patio table near the sliding door. Danielle followed, his boots crunching over frozen grass. On the table sat a first aid kit, the lid still open, a scattering of wrappers caught in the cold breeze. Inside lay gauze pads, adhesive bandages, and a half-empty bottle of antiseptic solution. Daniel lifted it carefully. The sharp clinical scent rose. Immediately, stronger than what most parents would use on a child. Rex gave a sharp bark, circling the table, tail stiff. Daniel studied the evidence in silence for a long moment before turning back to the Bennett. "You treated her." "Here," he said evenly. Jack nodded, shame flickering across his rugged features. "She was crying. I carried her." Inside, but Sarah was on the phone. "I didn't want to frighten Eleanor, not over what looked like a scrape. So, I cleaned it, put antiseptic on, bandaged it. I swear, detective, I thought I was helping." Sarah's hazel eyes brimmed with tears. "We would never harm Lily. She's like our own. We didn't call Eleanor because she was due any hour, and Lily seemed fine afterwards. She went back to playing, laughing." Daniel listened, his steel blue gaze weighing their words. He had heard many stories over the years, some dripping with deceit, others heavy with simple human error. What he saw now in the Bennetts was not malice, but remorse. The anxious, the earnestness of people who had made a poor decision, not a cruel one. Still, procedure was procedure. He closed the first aid kit and slipped it into an evidence bag. "You should have told Eleanor," he said firmly. Jack lowered his head. "You're right." Rex settled at Daniel's side, ears still alert, eyes locked on the kit as if confirming its importance. Daniel exhaled, steam clouding in the cold air. The bruise, the antiseptic, the bandage, it all fits what Lily told us. I'm leaning toward this being an accident, but I need to be sure. His gaze swept once more over the deflated rocket ship, the jagged plastic frame, the guilt-ridden faces of the Bennett. I'll need formal statements, and until then, I'm treating this as open. Sarah clasped her hands, her cardigan sleeves pulled down over. Trembling fingers. "Of course, whatever you need." Daniel turned back toward the gate, Rex moving seamlessly at his side. The German Shepherd glanced once more at the collapsed rocket, nose twitching, before pressing close against his handler's leg. The evidence was aligning, the picture clearing. Yet, Daniel knew from long experience that certainty was earned only when every angle had been tested, and until then, a mother's fears and a child's whispered words still hung heavy in the winter air. The soft hum of machines filled the pride. Pediatric wing, a mechanical lullaby that failed to calm the storm in Eleanor's chest. She sat on the edge of a plastic chair in the consultation room, her fingers digging into her palms so tightly the half-moon marks of her nails showed pale against her skin. Just outside the glass door, she could see Lily coloring quietly at a low table, her face illuminated by the glow of the lamp above. The innocence of the picture stabbed at Eleanor's heart. How could something so fragile be carrying such heavy shadows? The door creaked open, and Dr. Caroline Hughes stepped in, holding a folder of lab results. The auburn-haired physician looked older than she had just an hour ago, as though the papers in her hand weighed far more than they should. She adjusted her glasses and sat opposite Eleanor, her hazel eyes unusually somber. "Eleanor," she began softly, "we received Lily's blood test results." Eleanor braced herself, every muscle tight. "There's something unusual," Caroline continued. "We detected traces of a sedative called Zolarum. It's not a medication prescribed for children. It isn't even approved for pediatric use." The room spun, Eleanor's breath caught, and the folder in Caroline's hands blurred before her eyes. Her body swayed, and, for a terrifying second, she thought she might faint. No, that's not possible," she whispered. "She's 6 years old. I would never." Her voice cracked, collapsing under the weight of disbelief. Caroline reached forward, laying a hand gently on Eleanor's trembling wrist. "I know you wouldn't. This isn't about blame, but the fact remains. It's in her system. We have to understand how it got there." The door swung open again, and Detective Daniel Harris entered, Rex padding loyally at his side. Daniel's tall, rugged frame carried an unmistakable gravity. His steel blue eyes darkened further as he took the file from Caroline and scanned the results. His jaw flexed, the stubble along his chin accentuating the tension. "A sedative," Daniel muttered. "That changes everything." He turned his gaze to Eleanor, his voice steady, but firm. "This isn't just about a fall anymore. We're dealing with something that could have been deliberate." Eleanor shook her head violently, strands of her chestnut hair falling loose from her bun. "No, you don't understand. The Bennetts would never. Jack, Sarah, they love Lily like their own. They'd never give her something like this." Daniel crouched in front of her, lowering himself so that his eyes met hers on the same level. "Eleanor, I'm not accusing anyone yet, but sedatives don't just appear out of nowhere. We need to retrace every step of what Lily ate or drank." At the sound of her name, Rex lifted his head, ears flicking forward. The German shepherd pressed closer to Lily's chair, his amber eyes sharp. He seemed to sense the shift in tension, the way air itself grew heavier with suspicion. Caroline leaned forward, her voice cautious. "The dosage is low. It wouldn't have caused unconsciousness, but it could explain her fatigue, her fall, even her confusion afterward." Eleanor buried her face in her hands, shoulders shaking. She had clung to the fragile relief of thinking this was all an accident, but now that comfort had been ripped away. Daniel stood, his mind already moving through the puzzle. He paced the small room, hands on his hips. Lily mentioned eating pancakes at the Bennett, ice cream too. But if this sedative wasn't from them, then he paused, turning sharply toward Eleanor. Was there anything she ate before the sleepover? Anything unusual? Eleanor's thoughts scrambled. She had cereal and juice at home, nothing else. At the Bennett, she said, cookies, popcorn, ice cream. Her voice faltered. Cookies. She remembered Lily's excitement when Sarah had handed her a small tin of homemade cookies packed in a cheerful box covered in cartoon animals. Daniel's eyes narrowed. "Do you? I still have that box?" Eleanor blinked. "Yes, it's in my car." She didn't finish. Them. They moved quickly. Minutes later, in the hospital parking lot, Eleanor retrieved the box from the back seat of her sedan. It was cheerful enough to seem harmless, brightly colored with smiling bears on the lid. But the truth, Daniel knew, often hid behind the ordinary. Rex immediately grew alert, his nose twitching as the box came into view. The 6-year-old German shepherd stepped forward with controlled urgency, his muscles taut beneath his black and tan coat. Daniel knelt, setting the box on the asphalt, and gave a short command. "Rex, check." The dog lowered his head, inhaling deeply. Almost instantly, his demeanor shifted. He sneezed sharply, then sniffed again, circling the box. His tail stiffened, ears rigid. He pawed at the container with sudden intensity, then let out a bark, loud, sharp, decisive. Eleanor flinched at the print sound, pressing a hand to her chest. "What does that mean?" Daniel's face was grim. "It means there's something in here, and he doesn't like." Dogs trained like Rex can detect subtle chemical differences. If he's reacting this strongly, it's not just sugar and flour. Rex continued pawing, whining now, his nose pressed against the seam of the lid, as though desperate to drag the truth into the open. His body quivered with focus, and his amber eyes flashed toward Daniel as if urging him to act. Daniel snapped on gloves, opening the lid. The scent of sugar wafted out, but beneath it lingered a faint chemical note, sharp and alien. He picked up one of the cookies, holding it carefully under the light. "We'll need this tested in the lab," he muttered, sliding it into an evidence bag. Eleanor's legs gave out, and she sank onto the bumper of her car. "So, it wasn't the Bennett?" Her voice cracked, tears spilling freely. "Now, it came from the cookies." Daniel placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "It looks that way. Whatever's in these, it explains the sedative in Lily's system. But the question is, where did the cookies come from?" Eleanor closed her eyes, her mind racing back through every detail. The tin hadn't come from Sarah that morning. Her mother had given it to her, a gift from one of the residents, at the Golden Sunset Retirement Community where she volunteered. Eleanor remembered now Mr. Finnegan, the sweet elderly man who always offered Lily cookies. Her stomach twisted. Could something so dark have come from a place so innocent? Rex whined low in his throat as though sensing her despair. He pressed his head against her knee, grounding her with his steady presence. Eleanor stroked his fur absently, clinging to the dog's warmth as if it were the only real thing left in the spiraling confusion. Daniel's steel blue gaze remained fixed on the evidence bag in his hand. "This changes the direction of the case. We'll follow it through. But Eleanor, I need you to prepare yourself. Sometimes the answers come from places we least expect." The box of cookies sat on the hood of the car, harmless in appearance, but carrying the weight of a terrifying truth. And for Eleanor, the world tilted again. What had seemed a simple accident was unraveling into a mystery that reached far beyond the Bennett's backyard. The late afternoon sky over Redwood Falls was stray and pale, orange and gray, the light dimming against the skeletal trees that lined the road. Eleanor drove in silence, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles gleamed white. In the rear-view mirror, she could see Lily slumped against her booster seat, her small chest rising and falling in sleep. Mr. Buttons tucked beneath her chin. Beside Eleanor sat Detective Daniel Harris, his rugged features caught in the shifting light of passing street lamps. His square jaw was tense, lips pressed into a line that gave away his thoughts even without words. His steel blue eyes were trained on the road ahead, as though reading secrets in the horizon. In the back seat, Rex lay with his head up, ears erect, his amber eyes scanning for danger, even in the mundane rhythm of the drive. It was Eleanor who broke the silence. "Golden Pines," she murmured. "That's where this leads. I took Lily there before the sleepover. She always loves visiting my mother, Margaret, and Mr. Finnegan. He always gives her cookies." Daniel nodded, slowly. "Then, that's where we start. Golden Pines Retirement." Home stood on the edge of town, its red brick facade softened by ivy that curled over the entryway. The air carried the faint scent of pine trees and something sterile but not unfriendly. Eleanor parked the car, and together, she, Daniel, and Rex entered through the glass doors that slid open with a hush. Inside, the lobby was warm and welcoming, with armchairs upholstered in faded florals and the soft strains of classical music playing from a radio. A volunteer at the front desk smiled politely as they signed in. They were met by Margaret Miller, Eleanor's mother, a woman in her late 62nd, with silver hair cropped short around a face lined with both age and kindness. Margaret had soft blue eyes that mirrored Eleanor's, though tempered with wisdom. She wore a cream cardigan and simple slacks, and her gait carried the slow caution of a woman who had learned to measure her steps. "Eleanor," Margaret asked, her voice lifting with surprise as she embraced her daughter. "And Lily, why didn't you call ahead?" Her gaze shifted to Daniel, then Rex, her brows knitting with worry. "Mom," Eleanor said quickly, her tone heavy. "We need to ask about Mr. Finnegan. Did he bake cookies for Lily this week?" Margaret blinked. "Of course. He always does. Herbert's cookies are famous here. But why?" Daniel stepped forward, his presence steady but commanding. "Mrs. Miller, I'm Detective Harris. There's reason to believe something in those cookies contained a sedative. We need to speak with Mr. Finnegan directly and also check the kitchen." Margaret's hand flew to her mouth, shock registering across her face. "Good heavens, Herbert would never harm a child. Let's hope it's nothing intentional," Daniel replied. They found Herbert Finnegan in the common room, seated near a wide window where the last traces of sunlight bled into the sky. Herbert was 92, a wiry old man with a neatly trimmed shock of white hair and bushy brows that framed his watery green eyes. His skin was weathered and spotted with age, but his hands, though tremulous still, carried a precision that spoke of his long career as a pediatrician before retirement. He was bent over a jigsaw puzzle of the solar system, his thin fingers sliding pieces into place with care. When Lily ran up to him, he lit up with a smile, his wrinkles deepening with joy. "My favorite little astronaut," Herbert said warmly, his voice rich but quivering with age. "Did you finish Mars for me last time?" Eleanor's heart constricted. His affection was genuine, his delight at seeing Lily real. Yet, behind her relief at his innocence came a deeper dread. If not him, then who? Daniel crouched near Herbert, speaking clearly but respectfully. "Mr. Finnegan, I need to ask about the cookies you gave Lily." Herbert's brows furrowed. "Snicker. Doodles. My grandmother's recipe. I make them often, though these days," he lifted, his shaking hands with a row-fall smile. "I need help with the mixing. My hands don't quite keep up. Who helps you?" Daniel pressed gently. "Amber," Herbert replied. "She's a student, working part-time here. Lovely young woman, eager to help. I wouldn't manage half my baking without her." At the mention of the name, Eleanor stiffened. Daniel's gaze sharpened. The kitchen of Golden Pines smelled faintly of cinnamon and sugar, but the air had another edge to it, the tang of chemicals and detergent. Stainless steel counters gleamed under fluorescent lights. Daniel gave Rex a signal, unclipping his lead. "Check," Daniel commanded. Rex moved quickly, his paws silent against the tile. His nose swept the counters, drawers, and shelves with disciplined precision. Then he froze by a sugar canister, its lid askew. He sniffed, then let out a sharp bark, claws scraping against the metal container. His amber eyes flicked to Daniel, clear and certain. Daniel strode over, unscrewing the lid. The faint bitter smell beneath the sweetness made his stomach tighten. Eleanor pressed a hand to her mouth. "Oh God." Just then, the door opened. Amber Collins, a woman in her early 22nd, stepped inside. She was petite, with straight black hair, tucked into a loose ponytail. Her pale skin, marked by the tired shadows of long nights. Her brown eyes widened the moment she saw the detective Rex and the canister in his hands. She froze, a dish, a towel clutched against her chest. "Amber," Eleanor said sharply. The young woman's lips trembled. She took a shaky step backward, eyes darting toward the exit. Daniel's voice cut through the tension, low but firm. "Amber, stay right there." Amber's shoulders slumped, tears welled in her eyes as she shook her head. "I didn't mean to," she blurted out. "I swear it was an accident." Daniel's eyes narrowed, his posture shifting slightly, but not aggressive. "Tell me, what happened?" Amber sank into a chair, her small frame collapsing inward. "I was helping Mr. Finnegan make the cookies 3 days ago. I had a pill in my pocket. It was my roommate's prescription. She takes them for anxiety. I was supposed to take it myself before a double shift to stay awake, but it must have fallen out when I bent over the mixing bowl. Her hands twisted the towel, tears slipping down her cheeks. I saw it too. Late. The cookies were already baked, and then Mr. Finnegan gave them to Lily. Her sobs broke the room's silence. I should have said something. I was scared. If anyone found out, I'd lose this job, and I need it for nursing school. Eleanor felt a complicated storm inside her. Rage at the danger Amber's the mistake had caused, but also pity for the trembling young woman who clearly hadn't intended harm. Daniel's expression stayed measured, though his jaw was tight. "You understand the risk you took. That medication could have seriously harmed a child." Amber nodded miserably. "I know, and I've been sick of guilt since then. I didn't know what to do." Eleanor's voice trembled, equal parts fury and despair. "My daughter was drugged because of your carelessness." Amber lowered her head. "I'm so sorry." Daniel pulled out his notebook, his voice firm, but not without compassion. "You'll give me a full written statement, and the administration here will be notified. Because you confessed and it was unintentional, I doubt there will be criminal charges, but there will be consequences." Rex padded to Amber's side, sniffed, and gave a short, sharp bark, as though sealing the truth of her words. Amber flinched, then let her tears fall, freely. The sun had just begun to break through the clouds the next morning, streaking the horizon of Redwood Falls, with a fragile light that seemed almost symbolic. At Pinewood Community Hospital, the weight that had pressed so heavily on Eleanor's chest was finally lifting. The truth so tangled in, shadows, suspicion, and dread, was now illuminated. Lily had not been harmed by malice, but rather swept up in a chain of accidents, mistakes, and misunderstandings. In the waiting room, Eleanor sat on a vinyl chair, her daughter curled against her chest, Lily's soft brown hair brushed against Eleanor's chin, and Mr. Buttons, the teddy bear, was squished tightly between them. Eleanor's tears fell silently into Lily's hair, a mingling of sorrow for the fear endured, and relief that it had not become something far darker. Daniel Harris leaned against the far wall, his tall frame shadowing the corner. His broad shoulders seemed less tense than usual, and his weathered face, lined from years of grim cases, had softened. The faint scar along his jawline, a remnant from a fight years ago with a suspect armed with a knife, seemed less like a mark of violence and more like a quiet testament to endurance. Beside him, Rex sat in his usual alert posture, his strong body steady, ears perked, amber eyes sharp and intelligent. The German shepherd's chest rose and fell with calm breaths, but his gaze never left Lily. To Rex, the child was no longer just a girl. She was part of his pack. The sound of hurried footsteps broke the quiet, and moments later, the Bennett family entered. Sarah Bennett, slender and tall with shoulder-length honey-blonde hair, carried herself with the poise of a kindergarten teacher, used to soothing young hearts. Her soft green eyes were red from crying, and her pale skin seemed paler still under the fluorescent lights. At her side was her husband, Jack Bennett, broad-shouldered, with tan skin from years working construction. His dark brown hair was flecked with gray at the temples, his hands calloused and rough hands that built homes and cradled his daughter with equal care. Their little girl, Emma, trailed between them, her pigtails bouncing, her wide blue eyes filled with worry. "Eleanor," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling as she crossed the room. For a moment, the two women stood frozen. Then Sarah dropped to her knees, in front of Eleanor, reaching out to touch Lily's hand. "I am so sorry for everything you feared, for the misunderstanding, and for not calling you when she fell." Eleanor shook her head, her eyes brimming. She set Lily gently on the chair and stood, folding Sarah into her arms. "No, Sarah, I owe you an apology. I thought the worst. I doubted you. I doubted Jack, and you've only ever loved Lily like she was your own." Jack's voice, low and growly, cut through the moment. "If Emma had come home with bruises and said those words, I would have thought the same. Don't carry that guilt, Eleanor. We understand." His rugged features softened with compassion. Emma, sensing the moment needed something lighter, tugged gently at Lily's sleeve. "Do you want to see Captain Sparkles again?" she asked, holding up the stuffed unicorn with its tinfoil helmet. Lily giggled, her fear momentarily forgotten, and hugged the toy tightly. Then she leaned down and wrapped her arms around Rex's thick neck, whispering, "Captain Rex, the Rocket Guardian." Rex's ears flicked, and he wagged his tail, his amber eyes softening as though he understood every word. The room filled with a warmth no one could deny. Weeks later, Eleanor found herself standing at the entrance of Golden Pines' retirement home, her heart steady in a way it hadn't been for years. The administrator had offered her a new position, daytime shifts as a nurse coordinator. It meant evenings, home with Lily, mornings dropping her at school, afternoons visiting Margaret. The pace was slower, the patients older, but there was meaning in the work and a gentler rhythm that matched the life she wanted to build. Margaret, still spritly, despite her age, often teased Eleanor for looking younger already without the endless night shifts. Lily had become a small celebrity among the residents, darting down hallways with drawings, puzzles, and laughter. She was Mr. Finnegan's official astronaut assistant, and he beamed each time she sat beside him to fit another puzzle piece into the universe he carefully assembled. Amber Collins, the young nursing student who had confessed her mistake, was still at Golden Pines. Her dark hair was often tied back neatly now, her brown eyes calmer since she had unburdened herself. She had taken responsibility, completed a safety training course, and faced the consequences with courage. Eleanor saw, in her, not recklessness, but resilience. the determination of someone who had nearly lost everything and now vowed to do better. Daniel visited often, though he claimed it was just to check in. His sturdy figure became a familiar sight at Golden Pines, Rex always trotting at his side. The dog was adored by the residents who slipped him treats of turkey slices or crusts of bread. Yet, Rex remained ever vigilant, his keen eyes always scanning, his posture protective whenever Lily darted close. One Sunday afternoon, Daniel found himself at Eleanor's small home. The scent of fresh bread lingered in the air, warm and comforting, while Lily's laughter drifted from the backyard, where she and Emma had built a crooked little fort of blankets and sticks. Daniel leaned in the kitchen doorway, arms crossed, a half-smile tugging at his lips as he watched Eleanor dry her hands on a dish towel. "You look different here," he said quietly. Eleanor glanced up, one eyebrow raised. "Different how?" "Lighter," he replied, his voice low and unguarded. A soft laugh slipped from her, but her eyes softened. "That's thanks to Lily, and maybe thanks to you. And Rex." At the sound of his name, the German shepherd thumped his tail against the floor, a loyal sentinel who seemed to understand far more than words could say. Months had passed. What began in fear had reshaped itself into something sturdier. Trust, friendship, the fragile beginnings of a new kind of family. The Bennets remained close, Sarah picking Lily up from school when Eleanor's shifts ran late, Jack stopping by to mend a railing on the porch. Emma and Lily, inseparable as always, weaving their childhood into laughter-filled afternoons. One autumn evening, the air crisp and stars spilling across the velvet sky, Eleanor sat on the porch steps. Lily curled against her side, already half asleep, her small breaths rising and falling like waves. Rex lay stretched across Eleanor's feet, heavy and protective, while Daniel sat quietly beside her. "Funny," Eleanor murmured, her voice barely above the night sounds, "how everything started with terror. And now," she glanced sideways, a faint smile on her lips. "Now it feels like we've been given a second chance." Daniel nodded, his gaze steady on the horizon. Sometimes the darkest nights are the ones that lead us to the sunrise. For a moment, silence held them all, the woman who had carried scars, the child who had whispered secrets, the man who had stood guard, and the dog who had never wavered. It should have ended there, safe and whole. But then Rex's head snapped up, his ears pricked, his body stiffened. A low growl rumbled from deep in his chest. Eleanor froze, her arms instinctively wrapping tighter around Lily. Daniel rose slowly to his feet, scanning the shadows beyond the porch, where the rustle of leaves hinted at movement that shouldn't have been there. The peace they had fought so hard for was real, but safety, Eleanor realized, was never permanent, not in Redwood Falls. And in that suspended heartbeat, as Rex pressed closer and Daniel took his first step into the darkness, one truth became clear. Their story wasn't over. It was only just beginning. Because sometimes the greatest miracles arrive quietly, but the greatest battles come when you least expect them.